Take out your Bibles and open them to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6, where we'll be studying this morning. Certainly good to see everybody here. The Lord has blessed us with another wonderful day that we can come together and worship Him, and we should be grateful for that. We should praise Him for that, and we should appreciate all that He has done. I appreciate the many prayers that have already been offered on behalf of my parents, and continue asking for those prayers. I don't know of a better way to put it than the cancer has spread pretty much all through my mother's body. I don't know what that means yet. We don't know what treatment options are yet. I'm very nicely trying to say I don't have answers to any questions. I've shared with you everything I know, but I certainly myself and my family covet your prayers, and we appreciate what you've offered so far. Matthew chapter 6 will carry on in our series of studies on the Sermon on the Mount. I want to pick up this morning in verse 19. As Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body, so that if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters. For he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." We'll pick up in the text in just a little bit, but I want to stop there for the moment. And I want you to think with me about all of chapter 6, everything we've noticed so far in the sermon, as a matter of fact. Jesus has called on us to be different. He's been called on us to be different in character. He's called on us to have a different righteousness. He's called on us to practice our religion differently from the way others do so. And this needs to be manifested in the way we see ourselves, and the way we see our neighbors, and the way we see our God. And we've noticed that the citizen must embrace this call both inwardly and outwardly. It must be how I think. It must be lived out in my daily life and the fruit that I bear. And I think when you keep all that in mind, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 34, it presents a rather natural progression in the sermon as we begin to talk about the focus of the kingdom citizen, the ambition of the kingdom citizen, what it is that drives that citizen, the priorities that we ought to have. It's a section of the sermon that offers us practical means that we can use to measure our response to God and to this message of the kingdom. If we're claiming to live for the King and yet we're focused on this world, if we're claiming to live for Jesus and yet our ambitions are purely material, then we can be assured that our righteousness is no greater than the righteousness of the Pharisees. I want to think a little more about chapter 6 and what Jesus has already said in chapter 6, because I think this is important in helping us understand this transition in the chapter and to really fully understand what it is that Jesus is talking about here. He's calling us to spiritual pursuits. And what He does, He enters into a conversation that I think is about as complicated as anything else we could talk about, and that is the Christian's relationship with material wealth. It'd be really easy if Jesus had just said, everybody sell everything and be done with it. Or if Jesus had said, be as rich as you can be. Both of those, I think, would have been helpful, at least on our level of understanding, even if they would have been very difficult to practice. But the truth of what Jesus says is simply not that clear cut. It's not that obvious. We have to have a relationship with material wealth to survive in this world. And yet we need to make sure that relationship doesn't take over our lives. And I think chapter 6 in the whole helps us understand what he's saying here. You know, he talks about acts of worship, 3 different acts of worship, and we've talked about these. And in all 3 of them, he warns us to do them for their spiritual value, not for some material purpose, to serve God through these acts of worship rather than seeking self to be lifted up by other men. And then there's that prayer. We talked about the prayer last month. We talk about it as the model prayer because that's exactly what it is. Jesus shows His disciples how to pray. And if you remember, what we notice there is that prayer calls on God to hallow His name in the earth by carrying out His kingdom promises. That prayer talks about the will of God being done. And we talked a little bit about the church. And can you and I pray that prayer? And I really think we can. Because what we find out is that the church has begun, and yet there's an ultimate purpose that is yet to come. And that purpose is not fulfilled until judgment. And so what we're praying in this prayer is for God to carry out His spiritual purposes. And then we notice that even as we pray for our daily bread, why is the Christian praying for daily bread? Well, brother, it's not just so that we don't suffer physical hunger. It's so that we can have what we need to do the work that the kingdom calls on us to do. Even in that, there is a spiritual purpose. And so I think as we emphasize those things, we can begin to understand the relationship between the Christian who is living a spiritual life, who is a member of this spiritual kingdom, and yet resides here in this physical world. How do I relate those two? How do I live this spiritual life in this physical, material world? And I think what we're finding out in Matthew chapter 6 is that I ought to use the material to further the spiritual. I ought to use the material in such a way that it furthers the spiritual. And so what we're talking about when Jesus begins to talk about wealth and materialism, and I think even worry as we get down in the next section of the text, that rather than Jesus saying, don't have anything to do with wealth, don't have any appreciation for the material, don't think about the day-to-day, rather than Jesus saying that, I think what we're finding here in Matthew chapter 6 is Jesus is telling us how to think about wealth and the material and the day-to-day life. And what we're finding out is it has a spiritual focus. How can I use my material wealth to further the kingdom of God? How can I use this material world that I'm in and the material needs that I have and the way that those needs are fulfilled? How can I use those to be more active in His service and in His kingdom? And I think that's very much what we're seeing here in Matthew chapter 6. And so there's this somewhat complicated at times blending together of the physical and the material. The material is necessary, but secondary to life in the kingdom in pursuing the spiritual goals that Jesus sets forth for His disciples to pursue. Again, Jesus is not calling His disciples to poverty. Now, throughout history, there have been men who have come out and they've said that's exactly what Jesus does, and they want to go talk about the rich young ruler and instances like that, and I think there's a lot to talk about there and why that particular individual was told what he was told. But when you come to Matthew chapter 6, that's simply not the idea that Jesus has in mind. He's not telling us to be rid of everything. You know, I was thinking about this, and this passage in Proverbs popped into my mind. Proverbs chapter 30. And I think Proverbs chapter 30 kind of sets out the attitude that Jesus is calling on us to have. Proverbs chapter 30, and there in verse 7, the wise man says, 2 things I asked of you. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep deception and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I not be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or that I not be in want and steal and profane the name of my God. And I think this proverb does a wonderful job of kind of showing us the danger of the extremes. And neither one of them is necessarily beneficial to our spiritual life and our spiritual goals. There's no more spiritual value in poverty than there is in riches. Something else I think we need to be aware of, because we sometimes I hear people go to this passage and they make some arguments that I think go against some other principles we read in the New Testament. Sometimes I hear people talk about money in this life as if we ought to just give it all away every chance that we get and really don't be concerned about it at all. Brother, and there's a principle of stewardship that we read in the New Testament. I'm to be a good steward of all things that God gives me. And you know, if God has blessed me with the material things that I need to take care of myself and those that I have a responsibility for, I ought to appreciate that rather than squander that. I ought to appreciate that rather than just simply give that all away. That's not what Jesus is calling on us to do. As a matter of fact, good stewardship, providing for our needs, That often leads us to having enough that we can share. And I think Jesus makes it very clear in Matthew chapter 6 that there's spiritual value in that. And so certainly we should appreciate that. What Jesus talks about in this text has to do with attitude. It has to do with perspective. It has to do with the goals that we're setting for ourselves in this life. And I think if we focus on that, we can begin to understand this important message that Jesus reveals to us. I love how practical verses 19 through 24 are. Because we are dealing with this somewhat complex, difficult thing to navigate in life. And Jesus, I suppose, could have chosen to talk about this in a way that's very abstract and kind of left a lot up to our imagination. But He doesn't do that. He kind of presents us with two choices. And he gives us the pros and the cons of the two choices. And He says, you make a choice. And when you read Matthew 6:19 through 24, the only right choice becomes so obvious in practical ways that you can't miss it. What do you want to store up? What do you want to treasure? It's kind of interesting what He says there in verse 19. Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth. There's a little bit of wordplay. Where our English translations have something like store up treasures, it's actually the same word. It's do not treasure up treasures. And it gives you a little bit of the idea of what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is not saying don't work hard in this life. Jesus is not saying wealth is somehow sinful. Jesus is not saying any of those things we've already dismissed. What He's talking about is accumulation for the sake of accumulation. It may just be the generation that I'm from, but every time I read this passage, I picture Scrooge McDuck swimming through his vault of gold coins. That's exactly what Jesus is talking about here. That mindset that says I can never have enough and my life must be about having more. Why? Well, for the same reason Scrooge McDuck had that big vault with that big lock on it, right? Because everything in this earth will eventually be consumed. It is all finite. It is all temporary. It will not last. And so Jesus says, do not treasure up for yourself treasures on earth. Why? Because that's where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. It's interesting things that Jesus uses here in this description. We understand the idea of moth and garments in that day. If you had fine wool garments, they were often marks of royalty, certainly marks of wealth. And yet, those little bugs get in there. I had this happen to some of my suits one time. They got in one suit, before you know it, they're in 4 different suits and they've all got holes in them and they're ruined. And you don't even see it happening. It's this little insignificant thing, and yet it just eats it up. Now, if that's wealth that you've invested in, it's gone. It's gone. Most of our English translations go from moths to rust, and it's an interesting choice. It's from an old English translation. The actual Greek term is that which eats. It probably had more the idea of vermin, mice getting in. And you might think about it in the ancient world, one way in which you stored up wealth was just putting back grain, putting back corn, putting back wheat, right? And so we read about one man who tears down his barns and builds bigger barns, right? To do what? To treasure up treasure. Well, what always gets in the rice? What always gets in the wheat? What always gets in the corn? Vermin, those rats, those mice, they're going to get in there. What are they doing? They're devouring it. They're devouring. Can you stop it? We might think we can. Have you ever seen those videos from Australia? The answer is no, you can't stop it. You can't stop it. He talks about thieves that break in and steal. It's another interesting term. That word break in actually means wall digger. And I'm sure if you were in a first century Palestine and your house was actually made out of mud, that's a very vivid image, isn't it? You see, it wasn't somebody kicking in your front door you had to worry about. It was somebody digging a hole through your back wall and just walking in and taking it. Now, how much more secure can you make something than putting it in your house and locking it up and keeping it safe? And yet even there where you feel safe, Jesus says these things are not safe. Now, I was trying to think this morning, if Jesus was talking to a modern day audience, what illustrations would he use? And I think these work, but he might talk about inflation and corruption, right? I think sometimes we read passages like this and we go, man, those poor people in the first century, they couldn't do anything about the moths. And I mean, we just put cedar chips in there and they're gone. And they couldn't do anything about the rust or the mice. Well, we just put out poison and the mice are gone. Somebody's not digging through my wall. I don't know about you. Mine's brick. That'd be a hard job. We don't worry about those things. And I think maybe we have a tendency to kind of dismiss why we live in a more predictable world than they live in. Has anybody thought that for the past 2.5 years? Or has it been driven into your mind that there's no such thing? Because that's the truth, isn't there? I mean, it can all be gone. Just go check your retirement account and compare it to this time last year, right? And so what Jesus is describing here is how quickly and how easily material goods can be taken away. And you and I, we see this, we should see this, we should recognize it. And so his implied question is, why accumulate just to accumulate? Brother, he's not talking about a retirement fund in which we're saying, okay, I don't want to be a burden on my family. I don't want to be a burden on the church, so I'm going to put some back and I'm going to be a good steward. So hopefully when that day comes, I can be self-sufficient and maybe along the way I'll have enough I can share with others. And I think most of us have been blessed in that way. Probably far beyond that. That's one thing. But to simply say, I'm in the process, I'm in the business of seeing how much I can stack up. For what reason? What is it accomplishing? Maybe it inflates our ego. Maybe we think it gives us some kind of power. But again, brethren, decisions that you and I have nothing to do with can change the value of anything and everything that you have, can completely wipe it out in a moment's notice. Why pursue something that's that transitory? And that's exactly what he's saying here. He comes along to verse 20, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. And so he gives us this opposite, this other choice, and it's immediately obvious why it's the better choice. Because those spiritual treasures, what I bank in God, cannot be taken away. It does not become devalued over time. Now you've got to see the figure here. He's not talking about earning interest in some kind of spiritual bank. That's not the idea. But what is the money that you have in your pocket? What are the clothes that you wear? What are all the goods that you own? They're representation of the labor that you've put forth. That's all they are. They're visible ways of looking at what you've traded your time and your energy and your efforts for, and that's all any of that can ever be. Where have I spent my time? Where have I spent my energy? Where have I spent my effort? Has it revolved solely or even primarily around the physical and the material? Or have I recognized the temporary nature of this existence and put my time and my attention and my focus on that which is spiritual? Somebody says, Sean, are you telling me I need to quit my job so I can read my Bible more? Probably not. We can talk. There may be some things to consider there, but no. But why do you work? Why do you have the job that you have? Is it solely so that you can stack up more money? Or are you doing that in a way, have you chosen something that allows you to pursue spiritual ends? You know, if you have a secular job, odds are you work with somebody. Are you taking advantage of that to be a good example, to bear fruit, to teach the gospel if at all possible? Is the job secondary? It supplies something that you need, but you're seeking some other purpose? Brother, that's how we ought to be doing it. I'd say the same thing about school. I'd say the same thing about our recreation. Whatever it is that we're doing, we can do it for a primarily spiritual purpose, provided the thing itself is righteous. And certainly that's what we ought to be doing, is what Jesus tells us here. Sean, I hear what you're saying, but man, I mean, what do you want me to do? You know, I work 40 hours a week, and it really consumes my efforts, and it consumes my energies, and it doesn't seem like anybody wants to hear about the gospel, and you know, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to change? And oh, by the way, if I'm supposed to have such a spiritual focus, why'd God put me here in this material world? Man, we could come up with excuse after excuse after excuse after excuse, couldn't we? None of them are valid. None of them change these realities. None of them make the spiritual less enduring or the material more enduring. None of that happens. They're exactly what excuses always are. They're me telling people why my heart isn't right. They're me telling people why I'm not motivated in the proper direction. And so Jesus wants to offer us an inoculation against excuse making. He wants to share some more information with us and help us see and understand that whatever excuse we can come up with is easily dismissible. By the way, He does so simply by the way that He lives. Notice verse 22, the eye is the lamp of the body. So that if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. I think the King James doesn't say clear there, it says single, and I think that's a better translation of what he's saying. Now, a lot of critics want to come here and say, Jesus had this mystical, medieval concept of how the eye works and how light... It's an illustration. This is not a science lesson. It's not a biology or an anatomy lesson. That's not what Jesus is doing. It's a metaphor. The eye is the lamp of the body. It is through the eye that we experience the world around us primarily. So that if your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? It's so single, there's the idea of purity, it's clarity, it's singularity of focus is the idea here. And he contrasts that with bad, which is kind of interesting. Because the opposite of single would be multiple, right? And so the idea being, if I focus on one thing, the light is good. The impact, the result, the consequence is positive. But on the other hand, if the eye is bad, well, what would make it bad? Focusing on all these other things. Then the light that it brings in is darkness, and if that is darkness, how dark will I be? What's he saying? He may be saying more than this, but I think we can certainly agree that what he's saying is that I get to choose what I focus on. I get to decide what I'm going to fill my mind with. I get to decide what I'm going to pursue in this life. And nobody else can tell me what that is. Nobody else can change that. Nobody else can say, no, you can't pursue that. That's simply not how it works. Does anybody here like something that nobody else likes? Do you? I'm the other way around. I don't like things a lot of people like. Like if you and I were eating ice cream today, which I'd be glad to do with you at any point after church, and maybe I came over to your house and you pulled out like 5 cartons of ice cream. And you've got every flavor there is. Let me tell you which one I want. Every time, all the time, vanilla. Just vanilla. Do I want anything special on my hamburger? Ketchup. Just ketchup. And it's funny when I go places and somebody says, what flavor ice cream do you want? And there's like every flavor in the world. And I'm like, they got vanilla? I always get this, you're just weird. You're just weird. And my response is always the same. How about you eat your ice cream, leave mine alone, right? Just you mind your plate, I'll mind mine, and we'll be a lot happier, I promise you, right? Isn't life that way? I can decide to pursue whatever I want to pursue. I can decide for myself. I'm going to focus on spiritual. You want to focus on the material. That's your choice. That's your business. I'm going to focus on the spiritual. And you know what? You can make fun of me if you want to. You can tell me it's a foolish waste of my time if you want to. It's kind of like taking me to Baskin Robbins and saying there's 32 flavors. Why are you eating vanilla? Let me tell you why. It's what I like. It's what I want. You go do you. That's fine. Why can't we be that way about our pursuits in this world? About our choice to be spiritually minded, about our decision to say, I get it. The whole world is trying to stack things up as high as they can stack them. And every time I turn on my news, somebody's come over and knocked it all over. I don't want to play that game. I don't want to be in that business. I don't want to waste my life with that. There's something better. Does that mean I'm somehow above or beyond the material? Of course not. I need to eat. I want my air conditioner to run all summer long. The heater can run sometimes, but I want the air conditioner to run all summer long, right? There are clearly things in this life that are worth being concerned about. Nobody's saying anything different. But where's my focus? What am I holding out as my life's pursuit? By the way, we can also use this to determine that, can't we? Like, how much time... I used to drive my daughter crazy. We'd be talking about the Bible or something. I'd just giving her a hard time. She'd say, there's that passage, and I don't remember what it says, and I'd say, you know every character in all the Harry Potter books, and you don't know what that passage says? Giving her a hard time. But how many of us are like that? How many of us can recite, or how many of us that like college football can talk about a play that happened 10 years ago in an obscure game, I don't know, playing Kentucky, and you can remember the play just like that, but we struggle. We struggle when it comes time to talk to somebody about why they should be baptized. I don't know what to say. Now you want to talk about college football, guess what time of year it is. You want to talk about college football, you got all the excitement and all the information, it's readily accessible, but when it's time to talk about the Bible, I don't know. Brother, could I suggest that perhaps the light of your eye is bad? That perhaps if that's how I've lived my life, and I'm 20, 30, 40, 50, we can keep going, right? I've been in this world a little while, and I've had the opportunity, and I can recite all these facts about this thing I like, but when it comes to the Bible, what else could we conclude from that? Other than our focus is wrong. And don't misunderstand me. Nothing wrong with all those other things. You know what I did yesterday? I watched college football. Studied my Bible a little bit, came up here, did a little work at the church building, but I watched college football. I'm not saying we can't have those things. Jesus isn't saying we can't have those things. What Jesus is saying is what's primary, what's important, what's the focus. And you can fool everybody else, but you know what your focus is. Is it eternal or is it passing away? And brethren, we got to make a choice. Verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. Boy, he could not be any more blunt, could he? You cannot serve God and mammon. New American Standard translates that wealth. Turns out there was actually an idol called Mammon. It was considered to be a god of wealth, and so the translation works. But what he's talking about here is an idolatry, a choice to either serve the one true God or to serve an idol. And he says you cannot do both. Look at that. He doesn't say it's hard. He doesn't say you might not. He doesn't say you'll probably fail. He says you cannot. So if I think what I'm going to do is go through this world and I'm going to kind of put one foot in the kingdom and one foot on the material, and I'm going to try to have them be equally important but lean a little toward the kingdom, no. You already made your choice, brother. And it wasn't God. It wasn't the kingdom. It wasn't things spiritual. No, I've got to make up my mind. I've got to choose. And it's a choice that I cannot abdicate. It's a choice that I can't say I'm just not going to make it. I'm going to make it. And with everything we've just seen in 19 through 24, which one do you choose? Which one do you choose? It seems like the simplest choice we could possibly make. Do you want to accumulate treasure? Then which treasure is more durable, right? Which one is going to last? Do you want to be sure of your motives? Well, what perspective allows more freedom? What frees us the most? Do you want to serve the best master? Which one's worthy of your devotion? Again, these answers aren't hard to supply. I think anyone who believes what Jesus is saying, that believes He's the Son of God, that has any concept whatsoever of heaven and fellowship with God and what that is, these answers are so easy to supply. These are not difficult questions. And I know we could talk about day-to-day momentary choices. Brother, if that's how we look at life, we're going to be in trouble. What is my focus? What is my goal? When I get that secured, most of the day-to-day choices make themselves, don't they? If I'm pursuing a single thing, then many of the answers to life questions are fulfilled, right? For those of you that are married, you remember dating? If you've already raised kids or you're in the middle of it, you may have forgotten all about that. But there was a time, remember, before you were married? Do you remember what'd you want? You wanted to spend time with that person, didn't you? Did that only affect decisions that seemed to be directly related to that person? Or did that kind of shape most of the choices you made during the day? You know, you're going to get to see that person Friday night. And so there's things that can happen all week long that could take that away. And so what do you do all week long? You make choice after choice after choice after choice that do what? That put you in the company of that person Friday night. We find it very easy. We find it very simple. What do you want from this life? What are you pursuing? What are you seeking? Verse 25, for this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food and body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? And who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? And why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, nor do they spin. Yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Do not worry then, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. I think verse 33 is kind of the summation of the chapter and the point of this final section. Once we decide which direction we're going to go, once we choose the kingdom, once we choose Christ, once we begin pursuing fellowship with God, then that's what we must do. Seek His kingdom, seek His righteousness. You see, because that choice is a choice of submission. That choice says that I'm going to bow before a king. That choice says that I'm here to serve. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge that, by the way, not just by coming to church on Sunday. And it's not even simply by avoiding things that I know are sinful and doing things that I know are righteous. We're talking about the heart here. Do not worry, he says. We're talking about the heart here. We're talking about the mind. What are we pursuing? What are we seeking? I think this idea of worry is probably more complicated than we make it out to be sometimes. I think sometimes we define worry in this chapter far too broadly, and suddenly any sort of legitimate concern becomes sinful worry. And I know I've made this point before, I'll probably make it again. If that's the case, I don't know what to do with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Because there he is crying, and he's so stressed. Either his tears are as great drops of blood, or he's literally stressing himself to the point that blood is flowing out of him. And you can argue about that all you want. I don't care which one it is. The language that's used to describe him in the Gospels in that moment are the strongest Greek words that you can use to describe mental anguish and distress. So for me to come to Matthew chapter 6 and say, I just should go through life with a smile on my face all the time and nothing should bother me, I think is unrealistic. And I think it denies the very pattern of the life of Christ. So I think we've got to be careful here. But what we just noticed about wealth and about mammon, I think will help us to understand what he's saying here about worry. He's not saying do away with all wealth, do away with anything material. No, he's not saying that. He is saying don't let it distract you from your purpose of serving. And that's exactly what we've got to be willing to do with our concerns. We've got to put away those things. We've got to put away from our mind those things that prevent us from being able to serve God. And we've got to understand what it means to serve God and what it takes to serve God. And we've got to notice the significance of the spiritual above the physical. I think sometimes maybe we come along into this passage and we begin to look at it and we begin to say, well, what God is doing here is God is promising me that I'll always have enough to eat. God is promising me that I'll always have enough money. God is promising me that there'll always be enough of those material things. Brother, that's not what this passage does. That's not what this passage does. And I know we love to run back to the Old Testament and talk about that the faithful never go hungry. Except they do. Except they do. You know, think about the many times that Israel or Jerusalem is besieged and there's famine in the land. Guess who suffers? The wicked and the righteous. Brethren, Daniel went into the captivity. God is not promising, I don't believe here that God is promising that, hey, you'll always have enough. And here's why I think this is worth pointing out, because I think this is sometimes what brings us to worry. Is we mistranslate this, we misunderstand this to be God promising that we're never going to suffer too much, even though we'll run to Revelation and we'll talk about all kind of suffering. We want to come to Matthew 6 and say, well, God's always going to give me enough, my belly's full. That's not what He's promised. And so what that does for us, if we see reversal coming, if we find ourselves in a difficulty or in a strait, we begin to go, well, what is God doing? What has happened? And we begin to build this scenario up in our minds where either God has forgotten us or where we're just unrighteous and we don't know how, and we become Job all of a sudden, and we do all... Or maybe we could just understand what Jesus said. Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. What God has always promised His people is whatever is necessary to carry out His purpose. What God has always promised the faithful is what they need to do the work that's put before them. And brethren, when I come to Matthew chapter 6 and I start turning that around and I start saying, well, that should mean I should be fairly successful at work, and that should mean that I shouldn't have this problem or I shouldn't have... No. That's not what it says. We're getting back into that materialistic mindset. Remember what we pray in the prayer? Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. God, hallow your name. Make your name reverent by bringing about your purpose. Your kingdom come, your will be done. When we studied that, we went over to 1 Corinthians 15, and we talked there about the return of the kingdom to the Father. When does that happen? At the final resurrection. What does that mean? We're probably going to die first. Probably going to die. But when Christ hands the kingdom back to the Father becomes all in all. It's the ultimate expression of His sovereignty. What is my focus? What is my goal? What is my work? If it's to pursue those ends, the hallowing of the name of God, the accomplishment of God's purpose in the church, if I'm trying to be a part of that, a little physical suffering doesn't derail that at all. But if what I really want to do is go back to this idea of one foot in the kingdom and one foot in the world, and try to navigate that for the ultimate comfort, then I don't have many promises. And I don't have anywhere I can turn to trust. And I've lost my bearings. I don't know how to find my direction. And brother, I really don't have anything left to do but worry. So what's your focus? Where are you going with your life? What are you pressing on to do? Is it serve God and His kingdom? I hope that's the answer. Because in many ways it provides a lot of the solutions. Is it something material and fading? And friend, I hope I can change your course. I hope the message of the kingdom will change your focus. If you're here this morning and you're subject to the invitation of the gospel, why don't you come forward right now as we stand and as we sing.